Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Vanessa Clow, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Relations. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences, regardless of your location. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's featured presenter, Ruth N. Professor Emeritus of Photography, Jeffrey A. Wolin from the IU Eskenazi School of Art, Architecture, and Design. Professor Wolin is a renowned artist and teacher whose photographs have been exhibited in over 100 exhibitions in the US and Europe, including the Whitney Museum of Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the International Center of Photography in New York, and the Museum of Modern Art. Much of his work focuses on individuals who have experienced trauma. He will discuss his most recent series, Faces of Homelessness, during this evening's presentation, which is an attempt to debunk the stereotype of all homeless as drug addicts or mentally ill. Professor Wolin is a recipient of 2 Visual Artist Fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He is represented by the Catherine Edelman Gallery in Chicago. Following his presentation, Professor Wolin will be joined by IU alumna Yaël Ksander for the audience Q&A session. Ms. Ksander is a writer, radio host, and producer who contributes to the Limestone Post magazine and the WFIU Public Radio. Next month, she will be joining the staff of the IU Eskenazi School of Art, Architecture, and Design, from which she holds an MFA in painting. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's discussions. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over your screen and your toolbar should appear. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Wolin for his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Vanessa, and I'm thrilled to be here and to share my work with the College of Arts and Sciences alums and Yaël Ksander, who is a College of Arts and Science alum. I retired from my job as a professor of photography at Indiana University 7 years ago and moved to Chicago, where I have strong personal and professional ties. I have many friends and former IU students here. Catherine Edelman Gallery, which has represented me for over 30 years, is here, as are the museums I've had solo exhibitions at, including the Art Institute of Chicago and the Museum of Contemporary Photography. We decided to move downtown because we wanted to have ready access to all that this world-class city has to offer. But as I walked around in my neighborhood, I couldn't help but notice people living on the street, many asking for money, and sometimes quite aggressively. I wondered how they wound up on the streets, what their backstory was, and what I could do to address their suffering. This is the cover of Pigeon Hill Then and Now. It was my last series of photographs that I developed in Bloomington. It became a book and an exhibition, and it involved locating individuals that I had photographed in Bloomington's housing projects on the west side of town in the late 80s, and then went back and rephotographed and interviewing them a generation later to see how their lives had changed. As it happened, one of the individuals that I included in the project, Danny Hayes, had become homeless in the intervening 25 years since I initially photographed him. This portrait gave me insight into the difficulties of his life living outside year-round. So the image on the left, Danny with Tina and Willard, Pigeon Hill, 1989. I'm quoting Danny here. Those were good times back then. I had a great dog, Willard, my girlfriend, Tina, and a car. And then I wrote all that with a silver marker on his car, on the photograph. The one on the right, Danny at 7-Eleven, Pigeon Hill, 2012. You can find me up here at the 7-Eleven visiting friends on the hill. I get meals at Shalom Center. Sometimes I sleep in a ditch at Twin Lakes Rec Center. So here's a different text treatment. So the camera that I was using, which is a medium format digital camera, records everything in full color, but I wanted to, in the previous image, match the image from 25 years earlier, so I printed it in black and white. But this is how it looked, and this current series is all in color. So I rebuilt the image of Danny, and this is kind of a bridge. This is the one that led me into my current project. Yeah, here you can see I'm using a typographic treatment instead of handwriting. And the interview was that I included this from was much longer than the one that I had done originally, and it had more information about how hard his life was and how important it is to keep totally dry and warm in the winter when you're sleeping outside. Also it goes into one of the reasons he became homeless, among others, was he was disabled. He had been in a really serious motorcycle wreck near I forget the name of the golf course and park, Cascades, over on I-37, or heading north out of town. And he left some of his brains on the pavement there. And he talked about all that and how it affected his thinking and his seeing. You see one of his eyes doesn't work very well. I was looking for a new project to turn my attention to as a photographer, my Chicago project. And the faces of the people living on the street seemed like a good place to start. I could have just wandered around with my camera and made photographs, but I'm not the kind of photographer who does candid portraits of people who are struggling in life. I always want the individuals I photograph to know who I am, what I'm doing, and to provide informed consent. At the same time, I was looking to support Chicago nonprofit organizations dedicated to dealing with the homeless. I learned that Chicago Coalition for the Homeless does great work. They're very highly respected in the homeless organizations nationwide. And if the New York Times is coming to Chicago and wants to talk about homelessness, they're kind of the go-to people. I contacted Doug Schenkelberg, the executive director of CCH, to arrange a meeting to see if I could learn more about the issues of homelessness and find individuals to photograph. To my surprise and delight, Doug welcomed me to CCH and offered to partner with me on my new series. CCH introduced me to their leaders group, which consists of individuals who have experienced homelessness and work with currently homeless individuals in shelters and encampments to get them help, whether it's medical needs, short-term housing, legal aid, and so on. CCH and its team of leaders has taken an active role in lobbying in the state capitol and here in Chicago for solutions to homelessness. And they very soon disabused me of my notion that all homeless are mentally ill and or drug addicts, which is a stereotype most of us have, kind of as Vanessa said in the introduction. Ask yourself, what image do you conjure up when you think of a homeless person? But in fact, most homeless are invisible. We don't see them. They live doubled up with friends or family. They live in short or long-term shelters, in hospitals or SROs, which are single room occupancy hotels. Some of them are called cage hotels because the only thing separating you from your neighbor is a fence. There are homeless veterans, many living in veterans' homes, some with still untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, individuals and families who were evicted when their residences were foreclosed on, people who had sudden medical expenses insurance didn't cover, job loss, divorce, death of a spouse or parent, domestic violence, coming out as gay, leaving foster care, lack of affordable housing, all drive homelessness. Several individuals that I photographed are working poor, living in their vehicles or in tents, and still working full-time jobs. I began my new series by photographing and interviewing some of the CCH leaders. As an artist, I combined my photographs with people's stories directly, with text included directly on their portraits. I'm known for my photo text series, including portraits of Holocaust survivors and Vietnam War veterans on all sides of the war, the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, and our own American troops. Maxica here is one of the leaders at CCH, and this is one of the very first portraits I made for the new series about 4 years ago. I love the way she and her kids are all dressed up for the portrait. Okay, moving on to the next one. And so I was off and running, continuing to partner with professional organizations that deal with the homeless crisis and are actively working to alleviate suffering while seeking more permanent solutions to homeless. This is Vinny at Venice Beach. I decided to expand the project by looking at homelessness on the West Coast and to see how it might overlap or how it might differ from Chicago. To that end, I worked with Venice Community Housing and Safe Place for Youth. Collaborating with professionals who work with homeless on a daily basis helps me address the issue of informed consent, an essential part of my work. I met Vinny, who sells his paintings on the Venice Beach boardwalk. And here's part of the story that he told me. I've slept everywhere from alleys to parking garages to sidewalks. I've stayed on friends' sofas. The community takes care of me. They look at me as a resident who lives outside. Homeless has become a dirty word. It should be a hate crime to use that word. I don't like the stereotype. We're not all the same. I'm not a shitty homeless person. I'm an artist. I've earned that right. I have my art supplies and my bass guitar, and that's it. I don't have piles of stuff. I'm not a hoarder. My work is fun. I like a certain depth of texture. I get canvases donated and I just paint over them. I paint a lot of clowns. They scare the shit out of kids. Scared me when I was a kid. I sold a big painting the other day and a leather trench coat that I painted a mural of clowns on. If I had my own place, I'd fill every square inch with murals because that's what my life is. One big painting. This is Janine, a certified nurse's assistant who works in a senior home caring for the elderly. The average wage for CNAs in the United States is about $14 an hour on average. For these essential workers, getting $14 an hour, try living on that in Chicago or Los Angeles or really almost anywhere else. You just can't live on $14 an hour. She says, I first became homeless when my mother died. Then my dog died. My stepdad is an alcoholic. He's evil. I'm a certified nurse's assistant. I told him to bring my mom to the nursing home where I worked, but he wouldn't. She had diabetes, always helped me with money. I met my fiance last January. He knew people here in Tent City. We got here in the spring. We were living in my truck near my job. During the polar vortex, we had to run the engine to keep warm until it ran out of gas. We had a lot of blankets, had to cuddle up together. It was brutal. I'm not going to stay out here next winter. My plan is to rent an apartment and get out of Tent City. I want to come home to a nice warm place. And really, who doesn't in the winter want to come home to a nice warm place? I met Rose, that's his nickname, through the Safe Place for Youth in Venice Beach. This is one of the most positive, supportive organizations I've encountered, and they focus on youth. And they just take care of kids. Anyone can drop in. They help you with your homework. You can stay as long as you want. They feed you. They work with you on if you want to play music, if you want to do art projects. It's just a fabulous place in Venice Beach. And if you're looking for a place to donate to that does really great work with the homeless, and you really want to support youth, this is a place for you. Here's Rose. I was a troublemaker, a gangbanger, doing drugs, hanging with the wrong crowd. I hid it from my parents, but my mom caught on. The night I left, we had an argument. What if you get us killed? I didn't want to cause any more damage to my family. I love my mom and dad. Everyone got along but me. I was going to commit suicide. I was hanging myself from a bedpost when my younger brother, Danny, came in, stopped me and hugged me. He said, "Don't go." I cried with him, took him back to his room. I packed up my stuff in the middle of the night. From that time, I was homeless. I was 9. I chose to be a gangbanger and a street person. At the age of 18, I had a kid. I got out of the gang the next year. I told them, I'm a family man. I'm done with this. They whipped my ass, pistol whipped me, broke my nose, left me with scars. Most people think homeless live on the streets and are dirty. It doesn't last forever unless you want it to. It's beauty and struggle. It's human. I want to become an advocate for the homeless. And this is Cecilia. Oops. I am a single mom of 2 boys. My oldest, his name is Juan. He is 4 years old and autistic, but not severe. My other son's name is Francisco, and he's 2. They are my world. I was living in a domestic violence relationship. I was unhappy for 5 or 6 years. I finally opened my eyes to the abuse. Nothing is easy. I thank God for my kids and for opening my eyes to help me leave that life. I became homeless January 2nd, 2020. Me and my 2 kids sleep in the living room at my mom's house. We don't have anywhere else to go. My dad gave me an air mattress. Every night I have to pump it up. Every morning I have to let the air out, fold it back up. My goal now is to go back to work and back to school to study child development. I want to work at daycare, save money and get an apartment of my own. Set new goals for your life, especially if you have kids, to show yourself and your kids that mommy is able to do it. And I love the triple portrait here. She's standing by this beautiful mural of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and she's wearing a T-shirt, coincidentally, that has the Virgin on it. And then, of course, she's the third portrait in this. And I wanted to, in this particular portrait, reference the retablo folk art tradition of Mexican painting. Frida Kahlo, certainly, who was a tremendous influenced me in terms of using this particular way of having a text panel as integrated part of the portrait. And this is at the opening at Catherine Edelman Gallery. Cecilia came and she spoke to the gallery goers. We rounded everybody up at a certain point and asked her to talk about her photograph and about her life and about her battle with homelessness. And she spoke about all that, and she got a little choked up. And then she said finally that she has a job and she has her own place and she and the kids are on their own. And when she was done, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. It was such a beautiful thing. And one of the things that's great for me is when I'm able to is keeping in touch with some of these individuals, to give them their books, to give them their portraits, to just see how they're doing. It means a lot to me. Nicholas is an LGBTQ youth who left foster care when he was quite young. He at the time that I photographed him along the River Walk, downtown Chicago, he was living at El Rescate. It's a transitional youth shelter at the Puerto Rican Cultural Center over in Humboldt Park. Here's what he had to say. On May 19th, 2018, I began my hormone treatment to transition from female to male and moved out of the group home. I came out in 2017 and everyone was supportive, but wouldn't allow me to get a legal name change or move to a boys' home. I want to be a classical pop musician and be on Broadway. I enrolled in voice classes to develop my vocal range. I'm currently in Triton College as a freshman studying art and music. My goal is to get a bachelor's in musical theater and a minor in voice. This is Char, and she's married and has a dog, Sadie Mae. She's cradling here. And at the time that I made the photograph, she was living in a tent outside Gold's Gym in Venice Beach, where sometimes you run into Arnold Schwarzenegger. She talks about how the shelter split couples up and pets are prohibited. So living in a tent on the street is preferable to that. And in her story, she goes on to say, one time I was just walking when a man called me garbage. It made me feel really depressed. Yeah, and who wouldn't? I just reconnected with Char when I was out in LA last month, so I could give her a copy of the book. And she and her husband moved away from the encampment on outside Gold's Gym, and they now have their own apartment in South Central LA. This is Melody, who's an amazing individual. She served in 2 combat zones and is a 5th-generation Native American veteran. I was sexually assaulted at the Naval Medical Center in San Diego after being roofied. I was taken back to my room and endured a trauma that changed my life forever. Everyone in the base started pointing at me. She's a liar, she deserved it. I convinced them to transfer me to another base. There was an altercation at a bar that triggered my PTSD, and I was wrongfully charged. The Innocence Project intervened and the case overturned. I got pregnant with my first son right after I got home. I stayed in San Diego for 6 years after that. My husband was an abusive drunk who tried to kill me on multiple occasions. I moved back to Chicago in 2006, got into another abusive relationship. Since 2008, we've had small bouts of homelessness. I wound up staying with my abusive boyfriend. When we were homeless, we stayed doubled up with friends and family. When I couldn't stay with friends, I'd call my ex and ask for help with the rent, with food, with rides. I know I shouldn't have called him. He beat me, stalked me, and tried to kill me. I still have those scars. I felt at the time I had no choice. I'm a single mom of 3, and my son has special needs and required multiple therapies and tutoring. I finally got into the VA system last year. My family was placed in housing by Volunteers of America. Being homeless doesn't define me. Surviving it does. So I've been in touch with Melody. She's She got a place, and now she's not only got a job, she's the executive director of the American Indian Center here in Chicago, which it's a national organization that is a liaison for American tribes. She's recently remarried and just put down a deposit on her house. Ronald is also a leader at CCH. He worked all his life and earned a master's degree in business. He was working at Loyola University when a new dean came in and wanted to move in a new direction, which eventually led to Ronald's termination. His condo went into foreclosure. After living for a couple of years doubled up with family, he finally went to a homeless shelter just as COVID was beginning to spread. The homeless were especially vulnerable to the virus, and he came down with COVID. After surviving the disease, he wound up in a subsidized senior residence in Bronzeville, here where I photographed me, is his lovely apartment. He volunteers at a soup kitchen 4 days a week and is a leader for CCH doing advocacy for homeless. He says, being homeless is an ugly, sad, and frightening experience. People should learn to be more compassionate, realizing that no one desires to be homeless. They should begin to advocate for this invisible population. I know most of us never imagined it could happen to us, but in these perilous times, it could. And this is my friend David. We became friends after I initially met him. And David's a staunch advocate for homeless in LA. He was living in a tent behind, this is Google's headquarters that he's living, that his tent is in front of. We become good friends and we spend time together every time I'm out in LA. He's a passionate, kind-hearted, intelligent, and funny man. Let me play his story.
Working nearly 20 years, including as an auto and bus mechanic, nearly 10 of them as a union mechanic, I returned to writing. Worked as well in the family business until it failed in 1992. I was 37 years old. I started living in my car. Soon it was a tent on a sidewalk. 80% of the meals in the past 20 years I've eaten have now come from dumpsters, in large part because I was refusing to take any money from the government, since conservatives are always berating us poor as the ones taking big bailouts. So I mostly only ate the food that society throws away. And seeking as well to contribute, I've organized 4 different Food Not Bombs collectives. They're a global movement. When I was a working class bus mechanic and a typical American consumer, I would gleefully go to the market and buy up all the foods advertisers want us to buy. My health wasn't good. I wasn't eating nutritious food, and my budget didn't seem to allow me to buy more nutritious foods that wealthy people could afford. But as a homeless person, I discovered that even eating from the dumpsters of organic markets was healthier than merely eating the poor food so expensively marketed to us average Americans. And surprisingly, even to me, it's here as homeless, but still contributing, that I found now the best relationships, most peace, and best health of my entire life.
Okay, well, let me continue my talk. So I was just out in LA last month and was distributing books to the people that I could find that I'd photographed. And David met me at this coffee shop, Groundworks, which is right behind it. It's a wonderful coffee shop on Rose and Lincoln in Venice Beach, real wonderful intersection, very lively. And he drove up in this car that he got. He's now a car owner. He no longer sleeps so much in his tent behind Google. He's moved and he lives in his vehicle. And he's solar powered, so he can charge his phone, he can have heat, he can make this thing work. And he wrote all over it because that's David. And let's see, yeah, the car provides him with shelter and transportation. And you can see he wears those Be Love things all the time. And he actually gave me one. So, and if I have time, I'll tell you I don't really, I need to move along. So let me move along. I'll tell you another story about David later. And here's Tom, who's the cover of the book. And I gave him a copy of the book. First time I was homeless, I was 14 years old. I was kicked out of the house. There were 7 of us kids. I was the oldest. My dad died when I was 6, my mom when I was 12. I'd heard about Uptown Tent City and I wanted to totally get involved, got me a propane stove and tank, and I started cooking for the community, set up a storage tent to keep things for survival purposes. There were about 25 of us under the Lawrence Viaduct and about 20 under Wilson under the Lakeshore Drive. I got elected mayor of Tent City. I'm homeless, but I'm happy. I'm doing what I enjoy doing, helping people. So now I can either play Mexico or we can go on. I can introduce Yael and we can move to the next part. What do you think?
I would go ahead and play the first slide
Okay.
and then have Yael join you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's lovely. And yeah, let's do it. Thanks.
Three years ago, I had a double mastectomy and 16 lymph nodes removed from my left arm. I had 6 months of chemotherapy. I was in the process of buying a house, but had to use the money for my chemo. We ended up, which is myself and my children, at Olive Branch Mission Shelter. We had our own room, but we had no doors on the room. During that time, I cared for my kids, took them to school each day, and then went to my chemo or cancer treatment. We were able to become a part of New Hope Apartments, and they helped us find permanent stable housing, and we've been here a year. I'll graduate in May 2019 with a degree in business administration, and then go on for my master's degree. I want to work with the homeless and cancer survivors to help them deal with their problems and to pay back what people did for myself and my children throughout our homeless crisis.
Okay, we good?
Yeah, I hear you. I hope you hear me.
Yes.
And it's really terrific to see, especially the pictures of your subjects holding the book, you know, because these really are, as one writer said, monuments to these subjects. And it's, you know, thank you for these really beautiful and inspiring and, you know, at times really quite heartbreaking portraits. And I love the fact that you have that sign around your neck. That's terrific. I wonder if I've in fact met some of your friends there on Lincoln Boulevard. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, to everyone who's come. And Jeff, thank you for sharing your work with us. You, of course, document the lives of folks in Chicago and Los Angeles, but across the US in January 2020, according to the federal point in time count, which is the way that homeless are counted, more than 500,000 people were experiencing homelessness in the US. And that's probably a conservative figure if you take into consideration the number of people who are doubled up and the quote unquote invisible homeless. And as we were talking, you know, the issue is increasingly urgent and relevant and receiving so much media representation lately. You know, many of us gathered here tonight might be acquainted with the topic because of movies like Nomadland last year with Frances McDormand. There's a new Oscar-nominated documentary called Lead Me Home, and then the series Made, of course, which touched on a lot of these issues. What do you think, Jeff, of all of this media focus lately? Why is this topic? This topic's been going on for decades, unfortunately. Why so much attention now? And do you think that this media attention we're seeing is positive, sensitive?
Yeah, I haven't seen the one you mentioned, the documentary called
Lead Me Home.
Lead Me Home.
Yeah,
But
the
certainly
40-minute one. Yeah,
I will definitely watch it. Nomadland, of course, Frances McDormand is the best, and Nomadland was really, really an interesting depiction of homelessness, but of course, invisible homelessness. They caravan around and go from one place to the next, and they don't have a fixed address, and work when they have to get some money, and then travel on. Made was also quite interesting because of its talking about, in a very sensitive way, domestic violence and the kind of abuse that women undergo that forces them in some cases, like Cecilia and Melody, to leave an abusive relationship and either stay with friends and family or wind up in shelters. So those are all great. Now, why all of a sudden is there so much attention? Well, I know when I started this thing a little over 4 years ago, I thought, oh, gee, at this point, there's so much about homelessness, in the media. It's people are going to run out of interest by the time I do something with it. But it's gotten more and more and more attention. There, as you say, now there's so much. There's Hollywood is paying attention to it. You can't pick up a newspaper hardly without an article about an encampment. They're sweeping it out. What should people do? They shouldn't, we need more affordable housing, but not in my backyard. And it's just, we're hearing the same arguments over and over again. If there's going to be a solution, there isn't going to be one solution. It's not going to be one size fits all. People like Melody and Cecilia, they need, supportive housing and some child support, and in some cases job training, in some cases not. Somebody who does have addiction issues, who has mental health issues, they need a roof over their head too, and they need care. They may not want to go willingly, as all of us have experienced, I'm sure, aggressive panhandling and somebody who's homeless who comes up and very, won't let go, and sometimes threatening. And the guy in New York who committed murder by pushing a homeless guy who pushed a woman in front of a subway and killed her. I mean, so what do we do about this? Well, they're going to need intervention. I'm not an expert on this. I work with experts, and they're going to need intervention. They still need a roof over their head. They need food. They need to get off the streets. But then there are encampments that are actually quite supportive and decent, in Chicago, where the alderman has provided, sanitation facilities, portable toilets, also in Venice Beach, and trash removal. And they're trying to struggle. They're struggling with, should we sweep the encampments and get these people out, or should we make it? Again, in Venice Beach, they'll bring in portable showers every few days, so that they can deal with the sanitation issues. So it's a complex issue, and there needs to be more affordable housing. If you live in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, you're not going to make it on $14 an hour. And so there needs to be affordable housing, subsidized housing. And that there was a lot more of that in the past. We've gotten away from doing that sort of thing. And there needs to be job training. There needs to be a variety of things. Kids need, the kids need school, and the parents might need daycare and for the kids. And it's just, there's not one size fits all. There are going to be I'm really excited about tiny houses for some people. For Melody, when she needed it, that would have been great. But for somebody who can't take care of themselves, who's hearing voices and screaming, that's, they need intervention. They need help.
Yeah, and clearly, you are an artist. You are a photographer. You're not a mayor or a governor or a legislator. So we're not asking. I'm not asking, at least, for you to produce solutions, Jeff. But one thing that you are doing is creating a great deal of empathy. And the way that you're doing that is described very well by Christoph Irmscher, who writes in the preface to your book. He makes a contrast between Susan Sontag's characterization of the predatory nature of photography, the fact that a photographer can very easily take a photograph without consent, and that's what many so-called street photographers did. But in this work and in your previous work, the Holocaust pictures, the Vietnam vet pictures, and the Pigeon Hill pictures, you avoid that. And Irmscher writes that your subjects aren't just the protagonists of these multimedia narratives, but they're co-creators. So you mentioned a little bit about how you got to know these folks, how you got together with the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless and the folks in Venice Beach to get introduced. Now, how did that process go? They they matched you up with folks. You said, hi, can I hang out and take your portrait? How did that go?
Yeah, they at CCH, they called a meet, the leaders meet every week. So they invited me to a leaders meeting, and I showed them my Pigeon Hill book, talked a little bit about who I was and what I was trying to do with this series, and asked for volunteers. And that's what happened. So they wrote down their names and their phone numbers and their addresses, and I would go to their place or wherever they wanted me to photograph them, interview them and photograph them. So that took me all over the city, which was kind of fun. There were some parts of town I'd never been, South Side, and so on. So that's how it worked initially. I have to say that with somebody like Tom or like David, who were leaders in the community, the homeless communities, they would sort of help me out and introduce me to their friends who were homeless. So it was, they were still being vetted. I was being introduced to people by people who I could trust, and they were taking me to people that I could trust to be good subjects, to be honest with me, to really help me out and work with me. So that's how it worked. It was kind of, a little bit of word of mouth, but everyone that I worked with was vetted, I was introduced either directly or through one of the other people that I photographed.
Mm-hmm. I see. So I do want to remind everyone that we would love to take your questions and broaden the discussion. Just if you're able, go down and hover your cursor over the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can put your question in there, and I will read it for Jeff. So please, we would love to have your insights and input here. So we talked about, and many of the subjects talk about how people have a tendency to homogenize this group when they're talking about homelessness. But as we have read and seen, the 40 subjects in your book have as many backstories and worldviews as there are people, and as many root causes for their homelessness as there are subjects. So in a word, they're just as diverse as the rest of us. Some are happy, some are desperate. Was it your intention when you started this project? You talked about Danny and getting into the project that way. Was it your intention to debunk these stereotypes, or did it come as a surprise that there was this much diversity? The artists, the people who were very happy to dumpster dive, the etc.
Yeah, so I didn't. I had the same stereotypes everyone has when I started. I knew with Danny because I knew him over a long period of time, and anyone living in Bloomington knows Danny because he rides his bike everywhere, and he's at the Shalom Center. He had the Crawfords was a place on the south side of town near the Y where they gave people who were chronically homeless meaning there's a specific definition for that. It's people who are those are your people who are the stereotypes of, and they've lived on the streets a long time, but they might go to a shelter for a while, and then they're back on the streets, and they live with friends or family, and then they're back on the streets. And so Danny was such a person. He was living in the Crawfords, having his own room and doing great, and having a shower and a laundry and everything, and he was ecstatic. But the next time I saw him, when I went to give him a book, he was out on the street riding his bike around. He was homeless again, living outside. So when I started up here in Chicago, I assumed that everyone that was homeless had issues, mental health issues, alcohol and drug issues. I had no idea about the invisible part, which is, let's say it's 65%. You hear different figures. The experts will tell you it's well more than half of the people you don't know anything about. They're the invisible. They're living doubled up. They're in shelters and other places. The number you cite, the 600,000, 500, however many, that's a point in time count. They get volunteers and they run around to encampments, and they talk to homeless and say, and count them in this way. It takes place on one night. That's it. And it's a very inaccurate way, but there is no really good way to, you can't do a census of people that don't have an address. They could be moving around from one encampment to another. So yeah, they taught me that. The leaders, and specifically CCH and then Safe Place for Youth, Venice Community Housing, really opened my eyes to the reality of homelessness, which is that it's much more widespread problem, that there are far more homeless than we count, and that the people who we think of as homeless are not the majority of people who are experiencing homelessness. Fortunately, a lot of people who are homeless, it's transitional. They're as we talked about with the women who were leaving abusive relationships, their homelessness was temporary, and for the most part, but not always, not living under a roof. But try to be a kid who's got to take their SATs. You don't have a fixed address. So yeah, it was eye-opening to find out about this, and I'm grateful to CCH and all the individuals who opened my eyes to the huge to the depth, to the size of the problem and the possible solutions.
Yeah, as if raising children isn't difficult enough. Imagine that. Really, really such perseverance on the part of those parents. So we are getting some questions from the audience. And we have one from Stephen who asks, this is kind of like a psychological question for you, Jeff. What drew you to this type of photography? Did you have a past trauma experience that caused you to go in this direction?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one that I asked myself. I don't know why I do these crazy projects. You think of art and you think of a nice landscape over a sofa, and that's not really what I do. I come out of a more literary background, and was an English major and started photography on my own, taught myself photography. My first job after college, after I got a little formal training in Europe, was a police photographer for 2 years, and seeing the terrible things human beings do to one another, the suicides, the shootings, I was up and close, very up and close on this stuff. I had to photograph somebody who was, who'd just been shot, who was waiting to go into surgery. I photographed lots of people who were in these very traumatic, situations. I did mugshots and, all that stuff. So 2 years of that, it probably had some kind of impact. I can't say for sure exactly how that played out. I'm sure it's in there somewhere. And so, yeah, I'm interested in humanity, in how people, the first real project like this was the Holocaust survivors. And I grew up in an area where there were a lot of survivors, and their kids went to school with me. And you didn't even know their parents had been in the camps until you went to your friend's house and saw the tattoo of Auschwitz on the numbers on their arm. But nobody talked about it. It wasn't done. And these survivors didn't even tell their kids about what they went through. But then later on, I don't know why I used Jewish Studies, had a really solid program where they brought people like Arnold Lustig and Elie Wiesel to campus. And I got to photograph Elie Wiesel and hang out with him for a while. And then the idea occurred to me, I would really like to do something with Holocaust survivors, but not celebrity survivors like Wiesel, but the guy next door. And I think part of that came from, I got a grant from IU at the end of my first year of teaching. And I went to Europe to photograph trees, which is what I was photographing, pretty landscapes. And I was staying with a friend who in Paris in the Marais, which is the old Jewish quarter. And she is actually the niece of the famous photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. And her mother's side of the family are Jewish and were in the resistance. And her grandfather was killed in Auschwitz. And so I was staying there, and she was telling me about what the war was like in Paris. I'd never, you know, I didn't know what it was like. We were in the US, everything is nice and safe, right? Except now and maybe not so much, but, and I wound up photographing in Père Lachaise, a beautiful cemetery in Paris, in the city where Jim Morrison of the Doors is buried, and all kind of French celebrities are buried. And I ran into a whole section of the cemetery, which is nothing more than memorials to people who were killed in the camps. And it was camps I'd never even heard of, like Mauthausen and Bergen-Belsen. I know I became a student of the Holocaust, subsequently, and I'm sure all of that fed into that project that became the Written in Memory Portraits of the Holocaust series. And then from there, well, war, right? There's trauma. And Vietnam was the war of my generation. And I didn't go. I got a very high draft number. We had a lottery, and I got a very high number, so I wasn't going to be drafted. But I had a lot of friends who were drafted, and some who went to Vietnam. And so that was interesting to me. I wanted to find out more about what it was like, what it would have been like if I had actually had to go. What was the war like? And then so one thing led to another. Pigeon Hill. What brought me to Pigeon Hill was the HT, the Herald Times. There was an article on the front page of the Herald Times about a graduate student named Ellen Marks. This is 1985, who was living in she became homeless. She was living in a tent, a lean-to up in Pigeon Hill, and was murdered. She was decapitated. The murderer cut off her hands. They never found her head. And it was gruesome, and it was in the paper for a long time. And that's what brought me up to Pigeon Hill in the first time to photograph life up there. I was curious, did any of you know Ellen Marks? Did any of you know the killer? Did you? And surely my interest and background as a police photographer contributed to that interest in crime and punishment stuff. So that's so those are some of the trauma fronts.
You also, just as an artistic influence, I know I've read you mentioning the fact that you were printing the negatives of Louis Hine, early 20th century photographer of child laborers and that sort of thing. So that too, I guess, was a formative experience for you.
For sure. And first of all, I didn't know as much about Louis Hine. I mean, I saw the usual pictures, and I knew about, the child labor and stuff. But we had, at the Eastman House, we had all his negatives, and we were printing them to, for exhibitions and things of that sort. And I got to appreciate what a great photographer he was. And it was so much fun printing his 5x7 glass plate negatives. And I prided myself on my craft skills in the darkroom. I was working at the Eastman House as a printer. I was good at that stuff. And I learned about the series that he was involved in. First of all, the child labor, but the first one that he did was immigrants coming to New York, to Ellis Island, being processed. And, that's a very timely series again, with all the politics surrounding immigration. But this was a great wave of immigration in the first decade of the 20th century. And Hine was there photographing these people, showing empathy and sympathy and love and care, and showing these people literally in a very positive light at a time when many of them were being, badly discriminated against as they settled into the US. So, and then I found the child labor stuff, and Hine's photographs were partly responsible for the legislation saying, no, kids had to go to school. They can't work in 9-year-olds can't work in the coal mines, but they were up until that time.
So that's the tradition that we all hope you're working in too, Jeff, to persuade hearts and minds of legislators. So this is kind of an interesting question. We have quite a few here, and we might go a little bit over, if that's okay with you, Jeff. This is someone who wants a more balanced story, I guess. Joseph asks, did you ever photograph people who have homes in areas where those who live on the street stay? So the homeowners beside the encampments.
No, that's a great question, and it would be very interesting. But and there are homeowners who bring food, to some of the to people in the encampments sometimes. But a lot of people who, especially in Venice Beach, where their homes are $1.5 million, are upset with the stereotype homeless, the ones who are shitting in their lawns and leaving crap everywhere and breaking in and screaming and that it's that for them, they don't want any kind of decent homeless shelter anywhere near them. They've been through a very negative experience. They have a very negative impression of this population because they're not seeing the invisible ones, and they're not seeing governments coming up with any solutions to the people who are making their lives stressful. So I get that. And some of the homeless talked about that. They talked about, even among the homeless, there are hierarchies. There are homeless, who live in vans, right? And they know that they're the sort of the aristocrats of the homeless community. They have a roof over their heads. One guy who was from Indiana, his parents were abusive. His grandparents in Chicago raised him and his brother. At a certain point, they aged out and went to California to seek their fortunes. He works off and on, and otherwise lives in a nice tent, a large tent that he keeps spotlessly clean. He's got a girlfriend and has a life. But he talks about how he understands why the people who live in these $1 million houses are very upset with having homeless people in the vicinity. They want them gone. And a lot of times they're more politically savvy and politically connected than the homeless people. So they'll be sweeps. They'll move the encampments out for a while, and it's a mess. It's a really difficult problem, and that's why there's so many movies about it now. That's why there's so much press about it. It's real.
We have a lot of questions. We'll try to get through a few more. Pearl has a question asking a couple of things. Did the participants choose their settings and poses? That's a good question. And then she says, we didn't see images of the doubled up or other residential situations besides the cars and tents, which makes those circumstances less tangible for viewers. Although there are some in the book. So yeah, did they choose their settings and poses?
Yes, yes, they did. And I wanted to photograph them in their environment. I'm an environmental portraitist, a milieu photographer, and that is really important to me. So I wanted to show where they lived, but they lived, if they wanted to be photographed, not where they live, but in a park or some other place where they go where it's tranquil. And some of them, were in school. They wanted me to photograph them in school. Some of them wanted me to photograph them in their new apartment or at a shelter where they're getting treatment. So in the book, there's all of that. We showed a very small sampling today. There are over 40 photographs in the book, and I worked really hard with the experts to get the demographic down, the number of men and women, the different racial, ethnicities, and all of that, ages, and circumstances, from the ones living, the more hardcore living on the streets to people living doubled up. So, to people who were formerly homeless, who experienced homelessness, and can talk about it, but aren't at this moment homeless. But homelessness is episodic. Sometimes you're homeless, you're not homeless, you're homeless again, like Danny. So I photographed Danny at the 7-Eleven up on Pigeon Hill on West 11th. He rode up one day while I was photographing other people, and that's how I did it. So great question.
So Peter asks whether you have safety issues when you're moving through these areas. Particularly with regard to your property, your valuable photo equipment. So do you have any of those issues? And if so, how do you handle that?
Great question, and something that anyone would give a lot of thought to as they started. So I started with the leaders, and who are obviously vetted. You know, they're people who are homeless or formerly homeless that are going out into the homeless communities and also going to the legislature and lobbying for homeless rights. But when I first started, I took people with me. I had a bodyguard. And yeah, I mean, it was a kid that I knew that I paid to just come with me and be there, watch my back, you know. So yeah, I was very aware of that, and became, you know, just took him with me for the first, let's say, 4 or 5 shoots. And then I realized, you know, you're as safe as you'd be anywhere. The encampments have their own kind of security systems, and I was being invited by people that I trusted, and so no, I never, you know, and yeah, I did have situations where people, one woman, I was walking near Gold's Gym in Venice Beach, and a woman was arguing with a guy, and I was walking by with my camera, and she was a little thing, but she looked up and said, "Get the fuck off this street, you know, if you know what's good for you, or I'll beat the shit," you know, I mean, like, so I just crossed the crossed the street and moved along. Yeah, I mean, I would be, if you want my advice, be careful, be prudent, work with people you know are vetted and are good people and aren't going to hurt you and are there to speak for you, you know, and vouch for you. But I wouldn't recommend everybody run out to homeless, you know, encampments and people on the street corners and the heating grates, and you know, you need to be prudent.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Obviously, one has to be always in a city, especially.
Sure.
I would say, just my 2 cents, that it's also what the great value of the work that you're doing is debunking these stereotypes or these equations of homelessness and criminal behavior. So, you know, there's a tendency to equate those things, and just from firsthand experience, I would say, having spent a lot of time on the strip there at Venice Beach in the day and in the evening and in quite late at night, I've never had anyone accost me or you know, so you know, there's a great deal of rhetoric, and I know a lot of the people who live very close by in Marina del Rey or something would never go there because of the hype.
Oh, for sure.
So that's the really valuable thing, Jeff, about the work that you're doing, is that you are humanizing people.
Before we get on to the next question, your point is really well taken. And in fact, the demographics that I've looked at show that in the homeless community, the amount of criminals, the amount of people who would hurt you or steal from you or rob you, is no different than the not homeless community. There are no more violent people that are homeless than are not homeless. It's a very similar demographic. So yeah, what you're saying is, if you're walking around downtown Chicago, you need to be careful, you know, but no more so if it's a homeless person you're talking to.
Yeah. One's housing status is not an indicator of behavior. So it's 8 o'clock. I'm asking your indulgence of our extended conversation, Jeff, and hoping that our audience can hang on. I don't see too many people leaving, so thanks for sticking around for this fascinating conversation of this great work. Just a shout out to you, Jeff, from Sean McInerney, who said, "I lived on Pigeon Hill. I remember Ellen Marks and the investigation. P.S. I was your son's teacher at BDLC," so that's going back.
Oh yeah.
And he says, "Great work." So we do have a question from Ed and Wendy Bernstein.
Oh, friends of mine.
And they are asking any ideas about the percentage of homeless in the US in comparison with Europe, particularly Scandinavia, where they have a more socialist system and free medical care.
Well, my first experience with homelessness was actually in Paris. I lived on the river at an artist place called the Cité des Arts Internationale, with artists from around the world. And we lived above a little park called Place Albert Schweitzer, and it was right on the river, on the Rue d'Hôtel de Ville. And they had people there called clochards. which was the French for the people who hang out by the clock tower in the plaza in the village. And but the term is basically the same as we would call bums, you know. And the clochard had no sans adresse fixée, the French say, without a fixed. Sans abri means you're homeless, you're on the street, you have no home, you have no roof. Sans adresse fixée mean you might be in a shelter, or you might be you know, doubled up or whatever. And that was my first experience with homelessness. They slept in the subway, they slept in the park, they peed in the park. So my kids were playing soccer, you know, the goal was the space between two hedges, and the ball would go in the hedges, and it was just covered with urine, you know. And so, you know, it was yeah, it was illuminating to see that homelessness is not an American phenomenon, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Other countries have better social safety nets. Ours, one of the things that happened quite some time ago was a decision to let people out of mental health, to close mental health facilities around the country. And those people were just put into the community with the idea that the communities would care for them. And they became the stereotypes of homeless that we have, but there are all those other factors we discussed. So yeah, the other countries take better care of their homeless because they take care of their citizens as a whole. They provide better healthcare and better educational opportunities and so on. We don't do that stuff. So we're sort of more of the pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality.
Yeah, there's a term that I've been seeing in the French press about your work, sans abrisme. So it sounds so much more poetic, and you know,
sounds great.
Shelterlessness, yes. So here's another question from Richard Jeff. He asks, have any of the social or political scientists that you've spoken with offered a solution and a price tag? I have an awful feeling that it would be a small fraction of what's spent on something like putting Mr. Bezos in orbit.
Yeah. Well, this is the big issue. This is the $1 million question: is how do you solve this? And again, you have to break it up into bite-sized chunks, and build more. There need to be more shelters. The tiny houses are exciting. If you're going to allow the encampments, you need to make sure that there are sanitation, there are showers and places for people to you know, go to the bathroom. And I mean, imagine being homeless and having to go to the bathroom.
Just so just robs you of your dignity, really. Yeah.
In the middle of the day, I had just come from a meeting with a currently homeless person at CCH. He was a leader at CCH, and we were walking on the lake under the L in Chicago, and a guy ahead of us, maybe 10 yards ahead of us, dropped his pants and took a shit on the sidewalk. And I looked to my friend, and he was appalled. But if you have no, you know, you can't go in. Where can you go to the bathroom in America? You know,
Basic
if
need.
you're homeless.
We all
So they bring in Venice Beach and in some places in Chicago, they have those porta potties, and they realize you can't just have the porta potties. You sort of need to hire somebody to watch them and take care of them, or they'll be trashed. It's the truth. So in Venice, in particular, they hire homeless veterans who are there 24 hours. They're doing 8-hour shifts and watching the porta potties to make sure that they're not trashed. So the solution is going to be expensive. Probably Jeff Bezos could have solved it in one with one check.
Gosh. Well, so someone else has quickly a practical question that's not really about photography, but what is the best approach to dealing with panhandling? This person says, it's an anonymous attendee. I've heard that giving money to the people on the street is not the best way to help.
So I've talked to my people at the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless about this very issue. And at this point, I don't give money to somebody on the street. I donate to CCH, to Safe Place for Youth, to organizations that do good work with the homeless. And you can contribute to, if you want to help, contribute to those organizations. Or I also give money to the Chicago Food Depository. They provide literally hundreds of thousands of meals a year. They box up food. People give them money. They get government money too, and they take the money, they buy food, cans, things that are not perishable, and they put them in boxes and they bring them to the soup kitchens and shelters and places where people, can grab a box and take, you have to have a kitchen to prepare those things. But for people who are, a paycheck away from being homeless, it's nutrition. And so organizations that care for the homeless or to keep people out of being homeless, because the rule of thumb is if you can keep somebody who's on the street, but you can keep them out, if you can get them off the street within a year, they have a much better chance of taking care of themselves in the future. After a year, it becomes harder, not impossible, but harder. And so I would work with these organizations and donate money to them rather than the individuals. I've sometimes given food, if I'm walking around with food and somebody says, hey, can you give me some money? I'll say, hey, I've got here's a bread. One time we got this beautiful baguette from a French bakery in Logan Square here in Chicago. And a guy says, hey, can you help me out? And I said, here, would you like this baguette? And he started screaming and he's like, I don't want your fucking bread, which was a turnoff, But then on the other hand, we've given food to people, like you leave your restaurant and you have food, pre-pandemic, obviously. You have your little dog bag and you go and you see somebody who's homeless and you say, would you like some of this, this Chinese food? It's really good. And they're like, yeah, I'm starving. I'm really hungry. That sounds great. I'm grateful. And, so or somebody will, ask for money and I'll say, look, there's a Starbucks over there. Can I get you a sandwich? And I'll get them a sandwich. But, if you give money to homeless, that's on you. If it makes you feel good, if it, that person, it might really help that person. Who am I to say what you should or shouldn't do? But my strategy at this point is to give money to these fabulous organizations who really are helping deal with, coming up with solutions rather than just Band-Aids.
And I wanted to mention that we're going to have a list of some of the local organizations that are supporting people experiencing homelessness at the end of this presentation. So we do have a great social safety network here in Bloomington. It's an ongoing, challenging issue, but luckily we have some very stalwart nonprofits who are working super hard to handle this issue every day. So obviously we do need to wrap up, but just real quick, Kelly Siffin says, thanks, beautiful work. And Alana Radetsky says, thank you, Jeff, for sharing your work, wishing the best for you. The presentation was great to express the voices of your subjects, and things really took off when you started talking more about your personal experiences. So thanks for your teaching, Alana says. And then finally, this might be a good way to wrap up. Irina asks, what was the most surprising story or person you came across in this project?
Huh. Fabulous question. I'd really have to think about it, but just off the top, David, my friend, and we're still in touch and we still see each other every time I get out there. And I'll end with this story. So we're walking along Main Street in Santa Monica. Actually, it's called Ocean Park, and
Boulevard or something. Yeah,
it's just I forget the exact name of this neighborhood, but it's between Santa Monica and Venice Beach. And David and I are walking, and of course he has his his thing on, and a guy who's got this really nice car is taking out of the back, out of this SUV, expensive SUV, an electric bike, because there's an electric bike store right there. And he's taking it in for repair, who knows what. And he sees me and Dave, well, he sees David, and he says, "Did you make that?" And David says, "Yeah." And he says, "Can I give you a hug?" And David said, "Sure." So they hug each other. And he says, "You gave one of those to my daughter a couple of years ago, and it changed her life. She was very desperate. She was depressed. And now that made all the difference. That one small gesture about love and your kindness and your generosity. And now she lives in Maine and she's doing fabulous." So yes, a very surprising and lovely man and a good friend now as a result of this project.
I'm sure you've made a lot of them. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for your presentation and for your great work, and all the best in your future projects. I understand you're thinking about turning the camera on rural homelessness next.
Actually, I've not. That was something I thought about
I see.
a couple of years ago. I'm working now with the IU Eskenazi Art Museum on a mid-career, no, I wish mid-career, on a full career retrospective that'll open there at the end of 2023. So as I've started to pivot and put all my attention into all of my series. The one thing I would add is that I also do some very funny, not traumatic series of photographs that will be part of the retrospective.
Well, that must be necessary after all of this extremely intense work. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa, who is going to wrap us up. Thanks to everyone who came out tonight.